The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Martin Luther King Jr. But what happens when that arc is twisted by prejudice, when justice is obscured by the fog of bias? It was a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia. The air conditioning in the Daily Grind coffee shop struggled to combat the humid heat, and a low hum of conversation filled the space. Sarah Jenkins, a successful lawyer, was meeting a friend for a quick catch-up. Sarah, a black woman in her late 30s, was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, her briefcase resting discreetly by her feet. She was discussing a recent case, her voice calm and assured, when she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The barista, a young white man with a name tag that read Chad, seemed to be watching her with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Earlier that day, Chad had overheard his manager, Mr. Thompson, making a racially charged comment about a group of black teenagers who had been loitering outside the coffee shop. "They're always causing trouble," Thompson had muttered, a frown creasing his face. Chad, eager to impress his manager, had nodded in agreement. He prided himself on his ability to read people, to spot troublemakers a mile away. And Sarah, with her expensive clothes and confident demeanor, somehow fit the stereotype he had unconsciously absorbed. As Sarah and her friend finished their coffees, Chad approached their table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice laced with an edge of hostility. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Sarah looked up surprised. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "We have a policy," Chad replied, avoiding her gaze. "We don't allow loitering." Sarah's friend, a white woman named Emily, bristled. "We've just finished our drinks," she protested. "We were about to leave." Chad shrugged. "It's the manager's orders," he said, his tone dismissive. Sarah, though taken aback by the blatant discrimination, remained composed. She knew her rights. She had faced subtle and not-so-subtle forms of racism her entire life. This was just another instance, another reminder of the prejudice that still permeated society. But something about Chad's demeanor, his barely concealed hostility, made her uneasy. As she and Emily gathered their belongings, Sarah noticed Chad talking to Mr. Thompson, who was observing them from the back room. Thompson, a portly man with a red face, nodded approvingly at something Chad said. Sarah felt a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This felt different. Outside the coffee shop, Sarah turned to Emily. "Something's not right," she said, her voice low. "I have a feeling this isn't over." Just then, a police car pulled up to the curb. Chad emerged from the coffee shop, pointing directly at Sarah. "That's her," he exclaimed. "She's the one causing the disturbance." Two police officers approached Sarah, their faces grim. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we're going to need to ask you a few questions." Sarah stared at Chad, her eyes narrowed. This had escalated far beyond a simple case of racial profiling. This was something else entirely. Then, she pulled out something that changed everything. "Racist manager called cops on black customer. Unaware she is a district attorney, paid dearly." Sarah Jenkins, a respected district attorney in Atlanta, Georgia, was about to turn the tables on the racist manager and his overzealous employee. The earlier incident at the Daily Grind coffee shop, where she was unjustly accused of loitering and then targeted by a false police report, had ignited a fire within her. She wouldn't let this blatant act of discrimination go unpunished. The police officers, initially suspicious, visibly shifted their demeanor when Sarah presented her badge. The color drained from Chad's face as he realized the gravity of his mistake. Mr. Thompson, who had emerged from the coffee shop to witness the scene, looked like he had swallowed a lemon. The power dynamics had shifted dramatically. Sarah, however, remained calm and professional. She explained the situation to the officers, emphasizing the racial undertones of the incident. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't resort to threats. She simply laid out the facts, her words carrying the weight of her office and her unwavering commitment to justice. The officers, now understanding the situation, turned their attention to Chad and Mr. Thompson. They questioned them thoroughly, their initial skepticism replaced by a stern seriousness. Sarah watched as the two men squirmed under the pressure, their carefully constructed facade of righteousness crumbling under scrutiny. As the police continued their investigation, Sarah felt a sense of grim satisfaction. She knew that this incident was more than just a personal affront. It was a symbol of the systemic racism that continued to plague society. And she was determined to use her position, her influence, to fight against it. The crowd that had gathered to witness the unfolding drama began to murmur amongst themselves. Some expressed shock at the revelation of Sarah's identity. Others voiced their support for her cause. A few even shared their own experiences with racial profiling, their voices adding to the growing chorus of discontent. The incident at the Daily Grind had become a public spectacle, a stark reminder of the racial tensions that simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. And Sarah Jenkins, the district attorney who had been mistaken for a troublemaker, was now at the center of it all. But the story doesn't end there. This is just the beginning of a much larger battle. What will happen to Chad and Mr. Thompson? Will they face legal consequences for their actions? And more importantly, will this incident lead to any meaningful change in the way people perceive and treat each other? The answers to these questions remain uncertain, hanging in the balance as the story unfolds. The aftermath of the coffee shop incident was swift and decisive. News of the encounter between District Attorney Sarah Jenkins and the racist staff at the Daily Grind spread like wildfire across Atlanta. Local news outlets ran the story on their front pages. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForSarah and #CoffeeShopRacism, and the incident even garnered national attention. The quiet hum of everyday life in the city was replaced by a cacophony of opinions, debates, and protests. Mr. Thompson, the manager of the Daily Grind, found himself at the center of the storm. His past racially charged comments, overheard by several employees, were now public knowledge. The carefully constructed image of a respectable businessman crumbled, revealing the ugliness of his prejudice. Customers boycotted the coffee shop, its once bustling interior now eerily empty. The parent company, facing mounting pressure from the public and its shareholders, issued a statement condemning Thompson's actions and announcing his immediate dismissal. Chad, the barista who had called the police on Sarah, also faced the consequences of his actions. He was suspended from his job, his future employment prospects looking bleak. The online backlash was particularly harsh, with his social media accounts flooded with angry comments and even threats. He had become the face of racial profiling, a symbol of the prejudice that many people believed still permeated society. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself thrust into the role of an accidental activist. She received an outpouring of support from across the country, with people praising her composure and her commitment to justice. She used her newfound platform to speak out against racial discrimination, emphasizing the need for systemic change. She didn't seek revenge against Thompson and Chad, but she insisted that they be held accountable for their actions. The legal proceedings against Thompson and Chad began shortly after the incident. Sarah, though the victim, recused herself from the case, ensuring that there would be no conflict of interest. The case was handled by another prosecutor in the district attorney's office, who meticulously gathered evidence and prepared for trial. The trial was a media circus. Reporters from all over the world descended on Atlanta, eager to witness the unfolding drama. The courtroom was packed with spectators, many of them community members who had been personally affected by racial discrimination. The atmosphere was tense, charged with emotion. The prosecution presented a compelling case against Thompson and Chad, highlighting their history of discriminatory behavior. They called witnesses who testified about Thompson's racist remarks and Chad's eagerness to enforce his manager's prejudiced views. They presented video evidence of the incident at the coffee shop, showing Chad's aggressive demeanor and Thompson's approving nod. The defense, on the other hand, struggled to mount a credible defense. They argued that Thompson's comments were taken out of context and that Chad was simply following his manager's instructions. They tried to portray Sarah as an overly sensitive and litigious individual, but their efforts fell flat. The jury deliberated for several days, their faces grim as they considered the evidence. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the air. The future of Thompson and Chad, and perhaps even the future of race relations in Atlanta, rested in their hands. Finally, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the charges. Guilty. Guilty on all counts. Thompson and Chad were convicted of racial discrimination and related charges. The crowd erupted in cheers, a collective sigh of relief sweeping through the room. Sarah, watching from the gallery, felt a sense of closure. Justice had been served, but she knew that the fight against racism was far from over. This was just one battle in a much larger war. As she left the courthouse, she knew that her work had just begun. But what new challenges and obstacles would she face as she continued her fight for equality? What other forms of prejudice lurked in the shadows, waiting to be exposed? The answers to these questions remained elusive, a dark cloud looming over the horizon. The trial of Thompson and Chad had sent shockwaves through the Atlanta community, exposing the deep-seated racism that lurked beneath the surface. The incident at the Daily Grind had become a rallying cry for those who were fighting for racial justice, a symbol of the systemic oppression that Black people faced on a daily basis. In the wake of the trial, Sarah Jenkins found herself in the spotlight. She was hailed as a hero, a symbol of strength and resilience. She was invited to speak at rallies and protests, her words resonating with a community hungry for change. Sarah embraced her newfound role, using her platform to advocate for racial equality and social justice. But the fight against racism was far from over. The incident at the Daily Grind was just one example of the many injustices that Black people faced. Sarah knew that there was still much work to be done, that the battle for equality would be long and arduous. One of the first challenges Sarah faced was the backlash from those who opposed her cause. She received death threats, her office was vandalized, and she was subjected to a relentless barrage of online harassment. But Sarah refused to be intimidated. She remained steadfast in her commitment to justice, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. In addition to her activism, Sarah also continued her work as a district attorney. She took on cases of racial discrimination, seeking justice for those who had been wronged. She worked tirelessly to dismantle the systems that perpetuated inequality, using the power of her office to bring about change. The impact of Sarah's work was undeniable. The incident at the Daily Grind had awakened a sleeping giant, a community united in their demand for justice. The city of Atlanta had changed, and Sarah Jenkins was at the forefront of that change. But the story doesn't end there. The fight for racial equality is an ongoing battle, one that requires the tireless efforts of individuals and communities alike. Sarah's journey is just one chapter in a much larger story, a story that will continue to unfold for generations to come.